Hi listeners, welcome to the first episode of MythConception Busters. I'm Jason from Spiritualbabies.net. As many of you know, I've made quite a fast transition really from the Christian faith through the Hebrew roots movement, and now I find myself approaching what I now call the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh from a very Jewish perspective. But what is that perspective? And for those of us who have maybe been on the same path or have been brought up in perhaps a family which wasn't very religious, what do we know about Judaism, and who did we learn that from? So the purpose of these programs is to explore not maybe the tenets of Judaism, but the misconceptions that people have about Judaism. Where do we get our information from? And do we test it fairly? Joining us every week is the Director of Education and Counseling at Jews for Judaism, Rabbi Michael Skobac. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here with you, Jason.
And for those of you that can't get enough of Rabbi Michael Skobac, you can also find him on JewsForJudaism.ca, Canada. Obviously, he's in Toronto. And also Jews for Judaism Canada on YouTube, which is a hugely popular channel. And you'll find links for those on the video right now or underneath this audio. So I want to thank you, first of all, for joining us and for agreeing to do this show. I think it's going to be a big thrill for us and going to be able to give us maybe a very fresh insight to a lot of the questions and a lot of maybe misconceptions that we have about Judaism. So would you give us maybe 3 minutes on, if you had to write your own job title, what would it be?
You know what? That's a really great question, because I think I end up doing so many things that can't be captured by my title. Often I joke with people that my job is really as a travel agent. And I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to help people get from point A to point B. So for many Jewish people, it could be Jewish people who are either disconnected from Judaism or Jewish people who are ambivalent or even apathetic about Judaism, and trying to help them move along to understand more and appreciate more. And they're often asking for help in terms of where to find resources and where to find appropriate places to connect. And then I also do similar things with non-Jewish people that contact me. They're people who've, generally speaking, had a journey through Christianity and now are either questioning it or moving away from it, and they are asking for my help to either connect with Judaism somehow or to find a path, a spiritual path as Gentiles. And so I spend time trying to help those people as well get from point A to point B. So maybe that's a fantasy I've always had of being a travel agent, and I can say that rather than saying that I'm a rabbi or teacher.
Fly Skobac. I can see it now. It's gonna catch on.
We give Franklin fire points.
Oh, that's awesome. That's brilliant. All right, so every week we're going to have a question, and I encourage the listeners now, if you have a question, not necessarily, in fact, preferably not related to the text of the Tanakh, but about the essence of Judaism and what that means, leave it in the comment below, or send us a message, and we'll filter through those and we'll pick the best ones, and maybe we'll include those in the future show. I was wondering actually whether it would be helpful to maybe define the term rabbi for someone that had never come across a rabbi before.
Well, it's a man with a beard.
Fair enough. You know what? For a lot of people, that's exactly what it is.
Well, I remember when I first went to a Jewish school, I wasn't quite in rabbinical school yet. I was in what was called a pre-rabbinic program. I was someone who didn't really have a Jewish education growing up, and I started late in life, and I had to make up for lost time. So here I was in my 20s, beginning to study the Torah, and it took me about 5 years till I was able to become part of a rabbinic program. But I remember that, I grew up in the United States, so I was living in the U.S. back then. And just because I was wearing a head covering, I was wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, most people called me rabbi, just because I looked like I was observing the Torah. So you can't always judge a book by its cover. Basically, a rabbi is someone who has studied a certain degree, a certain level of rabbinic law, basically Jewish law, that's been codified over the centuries, and it has been tested on certain areas of Jewish law. And if they have passed those tests on certain areas of Jewish law, then they are ordained as a rabbi. The truth is that we don't really have the ordination today that we had in the times of the Bible. There was a process of ordination of, it's called in Hebrew smicha, in English we call it ordination, which was passed down all the way back to the times of Moses. And that process of ordaining people really stopped approximately 2,000 years ago. Maybe it went on a little bit past that, but at some point in history it stopped. And there have been attempts to revive rabbinic ordination. Today, technically speaking, we don't really have ordination. We have what is called permission to make decisions in Jewish law, meaning that most questions in Jewish law, you don't need a rabbi to really resolve. Meaning, because there's so much that's been written, most people could theoretically just go to a library and look up many, many questions in Judaism. What happens today is because so many people are not able to access those codes of Jewish law, they have difficulty even doing that. So often the people that have expertise and knowledge of how Jewish law works today make those decisions. And more importantly, how rabbis really function today, at least rabbis that are in the classical position of what rabbis did, is to adjudicate situations that are new and have never been legislated. For example, and this really is something that we'll have to discuss in the future, but one of the valid questions in general about the oral law is, well, why do we need it? Meaning, why didn't God just put everything in a book? Why not just have everything in a book and that's it? You don't need any oral tradition, oral teaching. And one of the reasons is, and there are actually dozens, but one of the reasons is that the world changes. And there are things that develop over the course of history that simply didn't exist 3,000 years ago when God spoke to Moses. And so, they didn't have microwave ovens back then. They didn't have artificial insemination. And the question would be, what do we do with these new situations that develop that didn't exist thousands of years ago? And those are the kind of questions that rabbis really adjudicate, and real experts in Jewish law are really charged with trying to use precedent in Jewish law, things that have been revealed earlier, and apply those earlier revelations to present-day situations. Most rabbis today don't do that. That's something that happens only with the upper echelon of people that have been ordained. These are the great, great experts in Jewish law today. The greatest scholars will be the ones that are turned to, meaning that if a question like that comes up, no one in the world is going to call me. But there are a number of great sages today that are acknowledged as the greatest experts in Jewish law, and these are the people that would be consulted when something comes up that there's just no prior legislation on. We don't know what to do. And so rabbis, basically, the long and the short of it, are people who have a certain expertise in Jewish law, and today function in general as teachers of Judaism.
It sounds to me like it's very difficult to put that term into a box then. I mean, because I feel that you've got rabbis who are these great scholars and people that define law, and then you've got the community leaders, and you've got the people that offer pastoral care and work within the towns and in their synagogues to help raise a family and be a focal point and an example and someone that you can go to for questions. And so to take that kind of that pastoral community leader and to compare him to someone who spends their whole life defining what Judaism is in the modern world, but at the same time I kind of feel they're both doing the same thing, but on a different scale. They're both maybe answering the same questions.
Yeah, I guess one would be more in line with the historical classical role of the rabbi, which is the person who's an expert in Jewish law. And then you have what you could call the modern reality, meaning that, for most of Jewish history, the idea of someone who did pastoral care was not really in the position of the rabbis. I mean, that was something that all Jews had to do. And it's sort of, on many levels, sad that today we have the community professional who visits people in the hospital. So there are things today that have been relegated to rabbinic life that really were never originally part of the domain of the rabbi. But it's true that today rabbis have sort of a broader job description, than classically rabbis had. It was much more limited, meaning that for most of Jewish history, rabbis were scholars of law, legal experts, and now to a great extent have become communal leaders and teachers and advisors. And obviously it's helpful if these communal leaders are knowledgeable about Jewish law. It would be a great tragedy if the leaders of the Jewish people were ignorant of the basics of Judaism. But what happens today is that you have your rabbis that are in the ivory tower. They basically spend their time in a rabbinical school called yeshivot, and they're not really so much involved in the community at large. And they basically have their focus is on texts and on studying, and in some ways it becomes a handicap because they're not out there in the world as much. And you also have rabbis that are not in the ivory tower. You have rabbis that spend their time as rabbis of communities, of synagogues. They wish that they had more time to study and to really become more expert in Jewish law. And so what happens is you have this partnership, that you have rabbis that basically serve the community. They lead synagogues, they teach in schools, they have enough knowledge to be able to deal with the sort of routine questions that come up. And when things come up that are more difficult, even for a communal rabbi or a rabbi of a synagogue, then they would generally consult with the rabbis who spend all of their time studying legal texts, and really their expertise is more in theoretical legal issues. And so you have, a more complex communal leadership today, where you have different kinds of rabbis that assume different kinds of roles.
And I have to say, before we recorded this, each of us wrote down a list of questions that we'd come across before, and this is one of Rabbi Skobac's. What rabbis teach is more important than the Bible? I assume that we're only talking about the Tanakh here within the Jewish lifestyle. I guess this question doesn't come up, right? This is really a question that you'll get from a different faith group.
Actually, no. I mean, I often hear this from people within the Jewish community as well. That will often, object to something they're learning about in Judaism and saying, "Well, where is that in the Bible?" And so they often do play, what they consider to be those rascally rabbis against the Bible. And so this I hear from a wide range of people, that their assumption is that in Judaism, the rabbis place themselves on a higher level and is really as having priority over what the Bible itself teaches.
Are you suggesting that people are concerned about the tradition and maybe the ritual of Judaism compared to the text of the Tanakh?
I think this is something I've seen across the board in many areas, generally in terms of how Judaism is practiced, but even, I suppose, in terms of some spiritual teachings and philosophical teachings, there's almost this assumption that the rabbis have arrogated something to themselves that they shouldn't have, or that was never meant for them to have, and that somehow the pristine teachings of Judaism are contained in the text of the Bible alone. And so I've really discussed this topic with numerous people on a whole slew of topics. And I think it is fair to point out that the issue is a contentious and volatile one for many people. What I hope to do in the time that we have is to shed more light than heat on this topic. But it is one, I think, in terms of the theme of the program, it is one where there are tremendous misconceptions. And I think that even though people may ultimately take exception with the rabbinic perspective, I think it's at least important that they understand what they're reacting to. Meaning that it's one thing to not agree with a particular point of view, but it's important to really fully understand the point of view that people disagree with, rather than disagreeing with a straw man that may have very little relationship to reality.
Would this be down to elements of Judaism that come from oral law?
Well, I think that's a big part of it. I think that what happens is that there is this widely held assumption that we have the Torah, the Bible, the Tanakh, and then we have the oral law, which was invented by various rabbis, and that somehow the rabbis are imposing or asserting that their oral teachings take precedence and priority over the text of the Bible itself. And I certainly would understand why that would be disturbing, and but that's often what I hear. For example, let's maybe give it a concrete place to begin. The Torah says in several places that if people are engaged in a physical confrontation and one person causes bodily damage to another person, so the Torah speaks about, for example, an eye for an eye. It seems pretty clear that what the text of the Bible is teaching is that there's basically a tit for tat, that if I blind you, then the courts will blind me in response. If I like to fight with a machete and I chop off someone's hand, so that's what the court will do to me, because it seems fairly clear that the text of the Bible demands an eye for an eye, etc. And it's well known that the rabbis taught that that's not the penalty that's imposed, and the oral law teaches that we don't take out people's eyes and we don't chop off their hands, but we impose a system of financial penalties on the perpetrator of the harm. And I think the assumption is that the rabbis here essentially came up with an alternative law, their own concept, and that rabbinic concept, that man-made concept, overrides and basically trumps what the text of the Bible says. And I hear that kind of assumption raised regularly, that there's what the Bible teaches, and then there's what is called the traditions of men, or the teachings of the rabbis, or human doctrines, etc., human teachings. That's actually not the perspective that Judaism begins with. While there is, and we'll discuss this maybe later, there is a human element to the oral law. The important thing to understand is that the perspective of Judaism is that the oral law also comes from God, meaning that it's not as if the rabbis are coming up with their own legislation as opposed to what the Bible says, but you have a written statement in the Tanakh, in the Bible, which says an eye for an eye, and the oral Torah, which was equally given by God, says that the actual penalty for taking out someone's eye is 5 different kinds of financial compensation. And I guess what would come down to the crucial question here is that indeed true? Meaning, did God actually give such a revelation? Did God actually ever reveal this additional element of his Torah, his revelation? But at least what's important to understand is that the oral law is not, at least from the perspective of Judaism, it's not something that the rabbis invent and then impose over the Torah itself. Now, when it comes to this particular example, it's important to think about a number of things. Number one, I think we can ask at least 3 or 4 questions about the text of the Bible itself, and then we can ask one question about what is considered to be the oral Torah. If all we had was the text of the Bible, which would say an eye for an eye, so one thing that would be obvious is that it's clearly a barbaric and cruel kind of response. Meaning that it's hard to imagine. I mean, it's not impossible, but it seems to be a very distasteful kind of penalty that if you hurt someone, you'll have your hand chopped off or eye taken out. Now, if that's the will of God, then we have to deal with it, but it seems, at least prima facie, to be disturbing. A second problem with that kind of legislation is that it really wouldn't do the victim any good, meaning that if someone is blinded in a fight, or if someone is attacked and their arm is chopped off, so it doesn't really do them any good to have the attacker equally disabled. The third problem, and this is a problem that the rabbis analyze at great length, is that it really ultimately is almost never going to be fair. And here are a few examples. Imagine, for example, that the person who was crippled, let's say the person had his hand chopped off, that person was an opera singer, and the attacker is a pianist. So the person who's an opera singer can carry on with their career without the use of one hand. But the person who's a pianist basically will not be able to continue working if their hand is chopped off. Or imagine that the attacker who blinds someone, the attacker who takes out someone's eye, only had one eye to begin with. So here you have someone that's attacked and they're blinded, one eye is taken out, but a person is more or less able to see, maybe can't drive a vehicle or a plane, but a person's able to see quite a bit with one eye. But if the attacker has their single eye taken out, they'll be totally blinded. So the third problem, aside from the fact that it's barbaric and cruel, and aside from the fact that it doesn't do the victim any good, is that that kind of tit-for-tat punishment is often not really going to be fair in the distribution of justice. And so Judaism maintains that it was God himself who revealed that we impose a financial penalty that basically compensates for the loss of the limb, the loss of wages, the pain, embarrassment. I mean, there's a number of different issues that are assessed and the victim is financially compensated for. Now, I think on a logical level it seems to make a lot of sense. The question, though, I think it's a valid question, is, well, wait one moment. If that was God's intention all along, meaning if it was God's intention that we don't take out people's eyes and chop off their hands, and we do impose financial penalties, why didn't God just say that in the Bible itself? Meaning, why didn't the text of the Tanakh simply say, you make 5 different kinds of financial compensation if you hurt someone physically? Now, obviously it doesn't read as neatly, it's not as punchy, it's not as terse, but it's a legitimate question, meaning that the oral law seems to have God really speaking out of both sides of his mouth, so to speak, that God reveals in the text that you take out someone's eye or you chop off their hand, but God is saying, well, actually that's not the case in the oral Torah that he revealed, and he says we make 5 different kinds of financial compensation. So I believe that's a very legitimate question, and I think that at least one way of approaching it, and there are actually many different approaches, would be the following. That on some level, when a person does something as heinous and as horrible as poking out someone's eye or chopping off their hand, on some level, it just seems that to pay money doesn't really seem to impose enough of a penalty. That we are revulsed, and it is sickening to think about chopping off the court, chopping off people's hands. On the other hand, it seems that if you do something as ghastly as blinding someone, that all that happens to you is you have to pay some money. And it could be that had the Torah simply written that if you chop off someone's hand, you have to make financial restitution, that kind of revelation wouldn't really convey the ugliness of the crime. Meaning that it would seem to almost sanitize the crime and make it seem like it's less horrible than it really is. And it could be that by having the Torah say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, etc., what God is doing, at least on that level of revelation, is teaching us how serious that kind of crime is, and how revolting it is, and how disgusting it is, and how on some level, maybe on some theoretical level, what God is saying is, you know what, if you take out someone's eye, on some level, that's what you deserve to happen to you. Maybe on some cosmic level, it should happen to you. However, the Torah is not just public relations, and it's not just teaching us cosmic lessons. The Torah, God's revelation, has to work in the real world. And as we saw, there are several reasons why taking out people's eyes and chopping off their hands would really not be appropriate, and it wouldn't really work. And so what you have here is almost stereoscopic. You have the written Torah giving you this primal level of revelation, saying that when you chop off someone's hand or take out their eye, you have to appreciate how disgusting and heinous that action is. And on some primal level, on some cosmic level, you really deserve that. However, the oral Torah mediates that, and God says, but in the real world, that doesn't work. It doesn't help the victim. It's not fair. It's not just, and it's barbaric. And so the real penalty imposed is to make 5 different kinds of financial restitution. So I think that when we look at a law like that, a simple law like that, we begin to understand that it's not the rabbis who came up with this teaching that they replaced the Torah itself with. They didn't take their own ideas and basically displace the Torah that God revealed. But the way Judaism understands the rabbinic teaching is that the rabbis are conveying what was revealed by God orally. Again, I'm sure that there will be people who will dispute that and say, no, that never happened, and God never did give an oral revelation, an oral teaching. But at least it's important to understand that from a Jewish perspective, the oral Torah is not seen primarily as an invention of the rabbis. It's seen as a revelation of the Almighty that is taught and passed down by the rabbis.
And I think it might be helpful if we can lightly break down at a later date for the listeners a more structured understanding of what that book is, what it's made from, and its kind of conception from the general knowledge base of the people into hard copy.
You know, it's the kind of history that's hard to outline briefly, and I think that actually what we may be able to do is work our way toward that by understanding the components of the Talmud, and maybe after we understand its components, then maybe we can summarize at some future point and see how all these things came to be written down at some point, because obviously we all know the oral law was written down at some point. So it's sort of it's almost strange that we call this document the oral law, and yet it's now found in hundreds of books. So the first misconception I wanted to sort of puncture a little bit was the idea that the rabbis invented teachings that they that they then replaced the Torah with. They imposed over with God's revelation. And I think it's important to understand that that's not how Judaism sees the bulk of what the rabbis taught. But there are times, and that's why in the Talmud itself, we will find there are times when the rabbis did legislate things that were not revealed by God. And it's important to again, put that through your lens of whether or not what the rabbis teach is considered more important than what the Torah writes. So let's give one concrete example, which should maybe help us on this one. The Torah, as we all know, has quite a few prohibited sexual relationships. And what the Torah prescribes, what the Torah prohibits, is basically sexual intercourse with various people. So your mother, or even other relatives. There are long lists in the book of Leviticus outlining who we're not allowed to sleep with. Now, what's clear, at least fairly clear, unless maybe you want to get into a Bill Clinton type of analysis, it depends on what is. But what is not clear, though, is, well, what would the Torah say about other kinds of sexual contact that aren't actually going as far as intercourse? For example, we know that you couldn't sleep with certain people, but what about hugging and kissing them? I'm not sure what kind of equivalence you have for this in Ireland or other parts of the world.
It'd be like heavy petting, I suppose.
Yeah, or even going to first or second base. There are plenty of kinds of physical contact that don't go as far as actual intercourse. What does the Torah actually prohibit? And the Torah describes, the language of the Torah is essentially one of sexual intercourse. It wouldn't be in any way, shape, or form including, let's say, two people kissing on the lips or hugging each other. And so what the rabbis did was basically make a practical legislation. When you go into many subway systems in the world, and actually other places like trains or even some bus stations, so let's say in a subway there's tracks, and people stand waiting for the train. Now, theoretically, you could stand on the very, very edge of the track, so you're the first one that gets into the train that's coming. But most train stations have a yellow line that they paint to keep people going to the very, very edge of the track. Meaning they're basically saying, you know what, that might be a foolish place to stand. It may be a little bit dangerous to stand on the very edge of the track. So we're recommending that you stand on the other side of the yellow line. What the rabbis did in many, many cases was exactly that. Meaning that when the Bible says that you shouldn't have intercourse with certain people, so the rabbis said, you know what, we're going to legislate that if you can't sleep with a certain person, you shouldn't be hugging and kissing them, you shouldn't even be alone with them in a locked room. And this is never... The rabbis themselves don't claim that these were teachings that God revealed. These are things that they themselves legislated. Now the question is, are the rabbis ever claiming that this legislation is more important and just as just as authoritative and I guess in terms of penalties as serious as what the Bible itself legislated? And here the answer is no, meaning that the rabbis did make certain legislation to keep people on the safe side of the yellow line, but the rabbis were very careful never to confuse their legislation with what the Bible itself taught. So, for example, most of these prohibited sexual relationships could be considered capital crimes, and the court would impose, or at least theoretically, that's going to be another discussion someday, but theoretically the Bible imposes the death penalty. But the rabbis would not be able to impose a death penalty for violating their legislation. I mean, the rabbis were required to differentiate between their legislation, their human legislation, and the divine legislation of God. And one of the reasons for that is that the Bible itself prohibits adding to the Torah. And so what the rabbis were never allowed to do was to claim that their teachings, if it originated with their teachings, is equivalent to the Torah and carries the weight of biblical revelation. So they're allowed to say, look, as rabbis who were charged with protecting the Torah and ensuring that people are able to observe the Torah properly, we're going to paint a yellow line to make sure that people don't end up doing what the Bible prohibits. And it would be foolish to tell people it's perfectly fine to hug and kiss and engage in heavy petting and go to second and third base, etc., as long as you don't actually have sexual intercourse. That would be absurd. So the rabbis wisely, in many areas of Torah law, painted a yellow line and basically said, look, if you're someone who's concerned with following the instructions of God, if living according to the revelation of God is important to you, then you'd be very wise to observe these cautions and to stay on this side of the yellow line. But again, the rabbis did not insist that their legislation was somehow just as important on some level, or that it superseded the legislation of the Bible. And they had to specifically make it clear that no, this is a rabbinic legislation and it never would carry the same penalty as a biblical legislation. So that's a second area. The first one I tried to show was that the rabbis usually are not making up their own laws. They're revealing what God originally taught and wanted to keep it oral. Secondly, the rabbis do, in some cases, make up rabbinic legislation. They do have their own human legislation, but it certainly doesn't carry the same weight as biblical revelation.
You mentioned the point 3. Let's jump into point 3.
I said that?
Yes, you did.
Okay. This is really going to basically, I think, be a teaser for maybe what we can discuss down the road, because this would take a very long time to explore, but I'll just maybe open the discussion. One of the assumptions that Judaism makes, I think at least, according to my understanding, is that God intended to have human beings participate in the incredible enterprise of Torah. Meaning that, God put us in a world where we live in an imperfect world, which means that we don't live in a world where everything is there ready for us to use. We live in a world where we have to work with nature to find our food sources. We have to work with nature to find medicines. We have to employ technology to be able to move around in this world, to develop transportation. There's so much that human beings have to do. We don't just live in a world where everything has been laid out in front of us. And when the Bible speaks about the creation, even in the Garden of Eden, it says we were put there la'avda u'lashamra, to both work it and to guard it. So we have to both take care of the world that God put us into, but we also have to work it. And I think that's intended, meaning I think that the intention was that we were put in a world where we play a role, and we have to work with the natural resources that God gave us. And I think spiritually, Judaism sees it in very much the same way, that it's possible to think of the Torah as something where a big God lets people, very small people, in on his wisdom And basically, we're very passive. I think that's how some people look at Revelation. Some people see the Bible as God basically giving us the information that we need, and that's it. And that the only thing we have to go with is what God told us. Judaism, I think, takes the perspective which says that no, it was God's intention that human beings be part of the unfolding of Torah itself. And so that the Torah itself, like the physical revelation of God, God revealed himself really through his creation. It's interesting that, we often refer to God as Tsur Olamim. Sometimes they translate it as the Rock of Ages. But really, Tsur is like the Hebrew word sayar, which means an artist. And so the revelation of the world that we live in is a revelation of God. We live in a world with so much beauty and so much incredible complexity, and yet it's possible to see God in this world. Maimonides used to say that if you want to come to love God, study the creation, study the beauties and the complexities of the world that we live in. So God does reveal himself through his masterpiece in the same way that any artist reveals himself through their artwork. And God also reveals himself through his Torah. And in the same way that God didn't simply want us to admire the physical world from a distance and never touch it and never play with it, I think that God also didn't want us simply to put the Torah into some kind of into a protected box and to admire it and look at it, but never really get too close to it and touch it. I think that God's intention was that the Torah is really the raw ingredients, that God has given us enough spiritual revelation for us to then work with and develop and to unfold. And so we see, for example, that this role that the sages play, the rabbis play, in the interpretation and the development and the unfolding of the Torah, it seems to even be built into the structure of the Torah itself. I'll just give a simple example, but maybe this is all we'll have time to do this week. Let's say you have the question of, what do you do in a case of doubt? You have so many things in the Bible that God reveals, and life is never always that clear. For example, the Bible speaks about true prophets and false prophets, and that, false prophets, that's a very, very serious crime. There's even a death penalty. But the question is, what if it's not clear? Meaning, what if there's some question about whether someone is or isn't a true prophet? This comes up in every area of Jewish law. Every possible area of law, you can have questions and doubts and things that are not clear and things that are ambiguous. And what do you do in a situation like that? Now, it's obvious that God realized this, and what God could have said to us, God certainly is smart enough to know that this could come up in the future. And God could have said, look, boys and girls, I'm giving you my revelation, I'm giving you the Bible. It has a lot of legislation in it, a lot of laws, from the laws of the Sabbath to the laws of dietary laws to the laws of who's a false prophet. And I know that everything will not be perfectly clear down the road. So if it turns out that you're in a situation where there's a lack of clarity, don't worry. All you need to do is pray unto me, and I shall reveal unto you what to do in those situations. Meaning that in order to make things perfectly clear for us and not have to worry and not have to, just walk around in confusion, so God could have given us the original revelation and then say, look, at any point in the future, if something is not clear, just pray to me and I'll reveal the answer to you. I'm going to give you the answer. God certainly could have set up his Torah like that. certainly would have been within the realm of possibility. And yet, it's very clear that that's not what God did. We see it in the Bible itself. We see it in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, where God says, if there are questions and ambiguities, anything that comes up in many areas of Jewish law that is not clear. So it doesn't say in that chapter that you should pray to God and God will reveal what to do. It says you're to consult with the leading sages of the generation you live in. And God says to follow what they say, whether they say to do the left or the right. Now, the question is, isn't it possible that these human beings could make a mistake? And the answer is theoretically yes. But isn't it true that God knew that? Meaning, didn't God know that he's giving the responsibility to adjudicate and to make decisions in areas of doubt and areas of ambiguity, that God knew he was giving it to human beings who are not God. They're not infallible. They're human beings. And they're not perfect. And yet that seems to be exactly what God's decision was. And so it seems that God intended human beings to participate in the implementation and the unfolding of the Torah itself. And I think personally that this is a wonderful thing, because what God is saying to us is, I'm not going to treat you like incapable infants who are not able to really function. I mean, God could have related to us and God could have maintained that kind of a relationship where basically we're passive and he feeds us all the answers. But God says to us, no, I'm giving you the basic raw ingredients of revelation. I'm giving you the basic revelation. But now you are given the incredible responsibility of working things out. I'm giving you that responsibility. And you will become partners with me in the unfolding of the Torah itself. I can see why that would bother people, because people want to say, no, I want to know exactly what God wants. I don't want some human beings telling me what to do. And I understand why there's an impulse to want to feel that I'm not doing anything that was not intended by God himself. And yet it seems pretty clear that this was God's intention. God did not take the turn. God did not take the option of continual revelation, of telling us that he is going to break into history every time there's a question that comes up and tell us what to do. God is saying to us on some level, spiritually, God is saying, look, I trust in you, and I'm giving you immense responsibility. Now, clearly, he's not giving this into the hands of any Tom, Dick, or Harry. God speaks about giving it to the great sages of every generation. These are people that have earned the right to make such decisions because they've dedicated themselves to studying and understanding the Torah. But it seems pretty clear from at least chapter 17 of Deuteronomy that this was God's intention, that human beings have a role to play in really resolving issues of Torah and ultimately implementing issues of Torah and becoming part of Torah itself. It goes much further than this, and I think that this may be just a starting point.
We started off with the preposition, what rabbis teach is more important than the Bible. Would it be fair to say that the decisions of those sages lean on the Torah for their answer, rather than leaning on the opinions of the sages themselves?
Well, that's clear. Meaning that it's, if you want to say as an example, in the United States of America, there is a constitution, and everything that later legislation develops has to be based and rooted in that original constitution with the original amendments. And so the foundation of everything in Judaism is the Torah, is the revelation of God. We don't move away from that. And I guess at stake here, a question is, how much revelation was there? What Judaism has insisted all along is that the revelation of God, the original revelation, wasn't simply exhausted by what we find in the 5 books of Moses. That the original revelation itself had both written and oral components. That Judaism never really got focused exclusively on a book. It's almost an artificial kind of focus. I sometimes would call it bibliolatry. That, what's important to us is not a book. What's important to us is, what did God say? What did God reveal? And the Jewish narrative, going back to Mount Sinai, is that what we received from God was not only information that was found in a book. That God, and this is an important question, for various reasons, insisted on keeping part of his revelation outside of a book, oral. And that would be an important topic to explore at some future time. Why did God do that? Meaning, again, I think it's a legitimate question. Why not just put everything in one big book? Why have to have a book that you can carry, in one hand? Why not have God, give all of these teachings and all the revelations in a book? Why keep part of it oral? But at least in terms of understanding the narrative of the rabbis, this is something that has been our perspective, that the rabbis are rooted in what God revealed. And everything that they then interpret or adjudicate or legislate really has to be based upon that foundation. And what they teach doesn't really override or negate the revelation of God. It really can't ultimately.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you very much. We're going to wrap up there. So thank you for joining us today and for giving us your valuable time. It's been a complete pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us. If you have questions or comments, please leave them below. Share this video with your friends and come and join us again next week. Bye-bye.